Welcome back to Timeless Black Excellence. I'm your host, Abdias. In today's segment, we will be taking a somewhat different approach to our previously released educative material. We will be uncovering many examples of wrongful convictions that have contributed to America's mass incarceration problem in the last century. Don't get me wrong, the criminal justice system definitely has its place in our society when it comes to keeping law and order, as well as protecting the masses from dangerous individuals. But today we are going to highlight some of the deeply rooted flaws in some areas in desperate need of reform. Thank you for watching this episode of Timeless Black Excellence. Please like, share, and subscribe. When the criminal justice system accuses or convicts a person of a crime they did not commit, it is a horrible miscarriage of justice. Wrongful convictions can, in many cases, have caused innocent people, along with their loved ones, immense psychological, financial, and sometimes even physical harm. Most importantly, they may strip an innocent person of their freedom, in many cases, their lives. Did you know the United States has the highest rate of incarceration in the world? Having less than 5% of the world's population but nearly 25% of its prisoners, there are 2 million people in the nation's prisons and jails. This is a 500% increase over the last 40 years. Also, America is the only country in the world that sentences children to life imprisonment without parole. Racial bias plays a huge part in the overall conviction rate of those in prison. In fact, a study by the U.S. Sentencing Commission shows that African American men serve longer sentences than white men for the same crime. On average, 19.1% longer than those white men for the similar crimes. But get this, according to the 2019 annual report by the National Registry of Exonerations, up to 10% of those convicted individuals in the U.S. prisons are innocent. So, this leads us to the question, how common are wrongful convictions? In the past 30 years, numerous injustices have led to more than 21,000 years lost in prison for persons who later were exonerated. A total of 2,468 people were exonerated between the years of 1989 and 2019, according to the Neil Davis law firm. So, what are some of the things that contribute to wrongful convictions? First, according to the National Registry of Exonerations, over 50% of exonerations involve false accusations or perjury. And believe it or not, a study by the Washington Post found that more than half of all wrongful convictions are caused by government misconduct. Misconduct can be intentional or unintentional, but either way, innocent people are found guilty. When suspects are coerced by prosecutors and police officials, this leads to false confessions. Although it may seem unimaginable, innocent people confess to crimes they did not commit for various reasons. Social scientists and legal scholars have studied the ways in which human psychology and specific interrogation techniques influence risk of false confession. Other factors that can lead to a wrongful conviction include, but aren't limited to, bad forensic evidence, false accusations, and faulty jury selections where all white juries convicted innocent person of color based on racial bias and prejudice. And last, definitely not least, there are the dreaded eyewitness misidentifications, or causes of mistaken identity. These two factors are huge in contributing to wrongful convictions.
Sometimes our mental replay of something we only imagined can feel as vivid as a real experience. If you picture all the sights, smells, and sounds of a crime scene from someone's description, you activate similar brain networks as if you had really been there. You replay the scene in your mind, the more it feels like a real memory. That's why a detective who asks leading questions can inadvertently plant a false memory in a witness.
According to the Innocence Project, statistics state that nationally 69% of DNA exonerations have involved eyewitness misidentification, making it the leading contributing cause of these certain kinds of wrongful convictions. Why are eyewitness testimonies not as reliable as we once thought? First, crimes and accidents are unusual, often stressful, and even terrifying events. In fact, stress and terror can actually inhibit memory formation, and memories continue to be constructed after the originating event on the basis of information learned afterwards. Like a detective who asks leading questions can inadvertently implant false memories in a witness. Second, memory doesn't record our experiences like a video camera. It creates stories based on those experiences. And with the prevalence of video cameras capturing most anything we do, it is much easier than ever to check memories against actual recordings of events. And finally, memory distortion often happens unconsciously. Eyewitness testimony is a potent form of evidence for convicting the accused, but it is subject to unconscious memory distortions and bias, even among the most confident of witnesses. So let's give you some historical evidence of those mishaps and how they can destroy innocent lives. The movie Just Mercy is based on a true story. In 1986, a man from Alabama named Walter McMillan, played by Jamie Foxx, is convicted and sentenced to death for a murder of a young white woman in Monroeville, Alabama. His trial lasted only a day and a half, during which the jury ignored multiple alibi witnesses who testified that he was at a church fish fry at the time of the crime. Also, the trial judge overrode the jury's sentences verdict for life and sentenced Mr. McMillan to death. But it was later revealed that the state's witness had lied on the stand and the prosecution had illegally suppressed evidence.
Where there's no motive, there's no physical evidence, there's no corroborating circumstances, there's nothing.
The overwhelming evidence of innocence ultimately forced the state to agree to drop the charges against Mr. McMillan. The prosecutors agreed the case had been mishandled, and his conviction was overturned by the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals in 1993. Mr. McMillan was released in March of 1993 after spending 6 years on death row for a crime he did not commit. Bryan Stevenson, the best-selling author of the book Just Mercy and a widely acclaimed public interest lawyer, founded the Equal Justice Initiative in 1989. The EJI is a private nonprofit organization that provides legal representation to people who have been illegally convicted, unfairly sentenced, or abused in the state jails and prisons. They also provide re-entry assistance to formerly incarcerated people. Some of us are familiar with the Netflix series entitled When They See Us. This is a true story based on the Central Park 5 in New York. In 1989, the case resulted in the wrongful convictions of Yusef Salim, Corey Wise, Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana, and H.R. McCrae. All ranging from the ages of 14 to 16, the group from Harlem were convicted of raping and attacking a white female jogger in Central Park. At the time, the television coverage was overwhelming and was on the front pages of newspapers for months. The teens were depicted as symbols of violence. The racial tensions were inflamed by the propaganda that was spewed in the headlines. Adding fuel to the fire, weeks after the attack, real estate developer and future US President Donald Trump took out a full-page ad with the headline, "Bring back the death penalty, bring back our police." During the initial interviews with the Central Park 5, the police officers deprived the young men of food, drink, or sleep for more than 24 hours after their arrest. Following hours of illegal interrogations under duress, 4 of the 5 teens falsely confessed on videotape. The boys later recanted and pled not guilty, saying their confessions were coerced. Despite inconsistencies in their stories, no eyewitnesses, and no DNA evidence linking them to the crime, the young men were convicted on 2 trials in 1990. They spent between 6 and 13 years behind bars. But in 2002, along with DNA evidence, a serial rapist by the name of Mateus Reyes confessed to the crime while he was behind bars. The confession led to the release of the remaining Central Park 5 that were still in prison. And in 2014, the city of New York awarded the 5 men $41 million for wrongful imprisonment. Even though these tragic events led to these young men receiving a settlement for damages that were done to them, there are many examples where the payment is much smaller, and there are even more states that don't give a payout on wrongful convictions at all. There are 17 states without exoneration laws, and only those who are in the 33 states with compensation laws can get any money from the state. For example, New York has no limit on how much an exoneree may be awarded. California allows for a maximum award of $140 per day of wrongful imprisonment. Mississippi allows $50,000 per imprisoned year with a $500,000 cap and some attorney's fees. On the other end of the spectrum, in Montana, you cannot get any money, but the state allows for tuition, room and board at a state community college. Some states have stipulations that mean that if an individual was wrongfully convicted and later exonerated, the person isn't necessarily eligible for state's compensation. In Washington, D.C., and in states including Iowa and Oklahoma, the claimant must not have pled guilty. Or in Florida, those seeking compensation for being wrongfully convicted can't receive any compensation if their record includes prior felonies. And for your information, Washington, D.C. is the state with the most wrongful conviction exonerations in the country. So let's take a look back at some early causes of injustice that really impacted the Black community. Did you know the first person under the age of 18 to be given the death penalty was actually a victim of wrongful conviction? In March of 1944, two young white girls had been found brutally murdered in a rural, segregated town in South Carolina. A 14-year-old black boy by the name of George Steiny Jr. and his little sister were said to be the last ones to see the girls alive. Police came for George while his parents were out of the house, handcuffed him, and took him away. Police questioned George without his parents or lawyer or anyone else to advocate him, but during his quick 2-hour trial, there was little evidence and no recorded confession. In June of 1944, he was executed by electric chair, thus becoming one of the youngest American to be sentenced to death and executed in the 20th century. Decades later, on December 17, 2014, a judge vacated Steiny's murder conviction, calling the death sentence a great and fundamental injustice. 70 years after his execution by electric chair, George was exonerated of the crime that ended his brief life. Did you know a DNA exoneration occurs when a person who has been convicted of a crime is officially cleared based on post-conviction DNA testing? DNA exonerations represent only a portion, about 15%, of all exoneration in the United States. Although these individuals were innocent of these crimes, approximately 25% have confessed and 11% have pleaded guilty. These exonerees spend an average of 14 years in prison, 10% of whom spent 25 years or more in prison for crimes they did not commit. Reuben Carter, better known as the Hurricane, is another example of someone who spent over 2 decades in prison for a crime he did not commit. Born on May 6, 1937 in Clifton, New Jersey, Carter joined the Army in 1954 and then began training as a boxer. He won 2 European light welterweight championships, and then he turned pro in 1961 and began a startling 4-fight winning streak, including 2 knockouts. In December of 1963, he beat the then welterweight world champion in a first-round KO. But in 1966, at the height of his boxing career, Carter was wrongfully convicted of a triple murder and imprisoned for nearly 2 decades.
He put me in prison. Love's gonna bust me out. Just in case love doesn't, I'm gonna bust you out of here.
In February of 1988, a state judge formally dismissed the indictments and finally ended the 22-year-long saga. He was ultimately released from prison in 1985 when a federal judge overturned his convictions. His story inspired the 1975 Bob Dylan song Hurricane and the 1999 film The Hurricane starring Denzel Washington.
I served my time in a house of justice, and yet there's no justice for me. Justice, that's all it is.
In 2004, Carter founded the advocacy group Innocence International and often lectured about seeking justice for the wrongfully convicted. Another well-known organization that advocates for the wrongfully convicted is the Innocence Project. The Innocence Project was founded in 1992. They exonerate the wrongfully convicted through DNA testing and reforms that criminal justice system to prevent future injustice. As of January 2020, the Innocence Project has documented over 365 DNA exonerations in the United States. 21 of these exonerees had previously been sentenced to death. The Innocence Project's longest serving exonerated client is Malcolm Alexander. In 1979, Alexander was arrested for a rape charge that was based on a deeply flawed, unreliable identification procedure. A review of the trial record reveals that Alexander's paid attorney failed to make court appearances and to file important pleadings. And a deeper review of the one-day trial transcript reveals that the attorney failed to make an opening statement. He did not call any witnesses for the defense. He failed to adequately cross-examine the state's witness about the identification, and also presented an incredibly weak closing argument. In return, Alexander received a life sentence for the guilty verdict. And although the attorney promised to file an appeal for the verdict, he never did. The lawyer failed in his most basic duties to present a defense. He was later disbarred after complaints of neglect and abandonment were filed against him in connection with dozens of other cases. A judge later dismissed the indictment and ordered the release of Malcolm Alexander. And finally, on January 30th, 2018, after an excruciating 38 years, Alexander was subsequently released from the Jefferson Parish Jail. Wrongful convictions can work in a different way as well. This is more like a wrongful exoneration. No matter how obvious or how much evidence is revealed, juries fail to convict the perpetrators of horrendous crimes due to privilege, misconduct, or straight up prejudice. This is evident in the famous case of Emmett Till. And for those who don't know the story, on August 28, 1955, while visiting his family in Mississippi, a 14-year-old boy named Emmett Till from Chicago is brutally murdered for allegedly flirting with a white woman named Carolyn Bryant. 3 days later, his corpse was recovered, but it was so disfigured it could only be identified by an initialed ring that he was wearing. After seeing the mutilated remains, Emmett Till's mother decided to have an open casket funeral so that all the world could see what racist murderers had done to her only son. Jet magazine published a photo of Emmett Till's corpse. On September 23, 1955, the all-white jury deliberated for less than an hour before issuing a verdict of non-guilty to the assailants in Emmett Till's murder. But in 2017, Tim Tyson, the author of the book The Blood of Emmett Till, revealed that Carolyn Bryant, the white woman who originated the claims against Till, recanted her testimony. She admitted that Till had never touched or threatened or harassed her at all. This wrongful exoneration theory is more evident than ever in the present tense. The many cases of police brutality across America that leads to bodily harm, as well as the deaths of many innocent victims. This is a recurring event that is highlighted in mainstream media. Police corruption is a topic for another video, but did you know the original police were called washmen? They were originated in 1631 Boston and then in New York in 1647. 1702, South Carolina slave owners authorized its first official slave patrol. Virginia followed in 1726, and then North Carolina did in 1753. The first police department wasn't established until 1844 in New York City. These are some examples of the earliest forms of organized policing in the United States. Over-policing has been a problem that contributes to mass incarceration, wrongful convictions, and many more fundamental issues revolving around the criminal justice system. The crisis of over-criminalization and an excessive reliance on punitive enforcement feed the problem of mass incarceration. Today, the facts are well known. 2.2 million people are behind bars. More than 9 million people cycle in and out of the nation's colossal network of local jails. more than 4.5 million people are on probation or parole, and more than 70 million people have conviction histories that subject them to lifelong consequences to their lives and livelihoods. A criminal record can all but disqualify those wrongly convicted of housing, education, employment, and some places can permanently bar them from voting. But there has been progress, and significant criminal justice reforms have been put into place in recent years. After nearly 40 years of continued growth, the U.S. prison population has stabilized in recent years. This is partially a result of declining crime rates, but has largely been achieved through pragmatic changes in policy and practice. For more than a decade, the political climate of criminal justice reform has been evolving towards evidence-based, common-sense approaches to public safety. One example is racial impact statements. These are a tool for lawmakers to evaluate potential disparities of proposed legislation prior to adoption and implementation. They assist legislators in detecting unforeseen policy ramifications. Another example is in 2019, Nevada lawmakers passed the Assembly Bill 183, which bans private prisons as of 2022. The measure will prohibit the Department of Corrections from contracting with for-profit prison companies. Other states that ban private prisons include Iowa, Illinois, and New York. Between the years of 2016 to 2019, states like Colorado, Nevada, Kentucky, and New Jersey are granting voting privileges and voting rights to felons and parolees. Maine and Vermont actually allow prisoners to vote. Illinois and New York authorize expungement for prior marijuana convictions. California, Maryland, New Hampshire, New York, North Dakota, and Oregon also have record-clearing laws specifically addressing cannabis offenses. 27 states have decriminalized laws pertaining to the use of marijuana, and there are now 11 states with fully legal marijuana laws. I point this out because people arrested for low-level drug crimes are a huge part of the overpopulation of the United States prisons, and housing such individuals costs money. This money could be used for more substantial causes such as mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment, and other programs proven to reduce the federal prison populations. While the reforms help improve criminal justice policy, most of them will not have that much of an impact on the overall amount of incarceration. To truly help mass incarceration and wrongful convictions, lawmakers and advocates should eliminate mandatory minimum sentences and cut back on excessively lengthy sentences, shift resources to community-based prevention and treatment for substance abuse, invest in strong youth development programs, examine and address the policies and practices that contribute to racial inequality at every stage of the criminal justice system, and to remove barriers that make it harder for individuals with criminal records to turn their lives around. As a society, challenge racial disparity, address collateral consequences, and improve outcomes for justice-involved youth. Thank you for watching this episode of Timeless Black Excellence. Please do not forget to like, share, and subscribe.